to Fantastic History. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Clay.
We're a husband and wife duo who enjoy telling each other about amazing events, people, and mysteries throughout history. And I'm doing a listener request episode today.
Oh my.
Yeah, how about that?
That's great.
So if you're listening to this sometime in the future and you want to place this episode in a specific cultural moment, we are currently in the Wicked Part 1 movie era.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So like when I tell you this movie is everywhere, it is truly everywhere. And it has been for months now. It's like grocery stores, bookstores, commercials, probably songs on the radio if you listen to that, eyeshadow palettes, Stanley Cups, toys, memes, like anything you can think of. Wicked.
It's pretty wicked.
Now, I have not seen the movie or the musical, nor have I read the books that they're based on because I am one of those incredibly annoying, like Wizard of Oz purists. Okay. So, like, I will not engage with any material that does not star Judy Garland.
So you're only Wizard of Oz.
Wizard of Oz, like the original Judy Garland, 1939, and that's it.
That's it.
That is it.
Okay.
I've been that way my whole life. Like, this is not a hyper-specific brand of snobbery I developed as an adult. Like I've carried this with me for a long time. It is a burden I have borne.
Okay.
Like I've only heard amazing things about Wicked, so it's like I'm not like trying to be a hater. And I'll admit that I've considered like at least watching a clip from the movie or something.
Yeah.
To see if I want to give in to temptation because I've heard such good things, but like I cannot bring myself to do it. All that being said, today's episode is about Wicked.
I am shocked.
Well, I guess to be more honest about it, it's about the real life woman who inspired L. Frank Baum when he was writing The Witches in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz.
Wow.
Yeah, because there is a single woman upon whom all of the witches are based.
A single woman?
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so for those who who don't know, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the book, was actually full of political allegory. Like pretty much the whole thing. The Yellow Brick Road, for example, represented the gold standard, where Dorothy's shoes, which are silver in the book, by the way, instead of ruby, are supposed to represent people who wanted to stick with the silver standard instead. Okay. So we're trotting all over gold with the silver. Now, although this particular theory has been questioned by Baum scholars, there's really no way around the fact that when Baum adapted The Wonderful Wizard of Oz into a stage play way back in 1902, like he included the line, "You wouldn't be as bad off as John D. Rockefeller. He'd lose $6,000 a minute if that happened." In reference to like the gold standard versus the silver standard. So like, the man said it himself that was a big part of it. So let's stop being dumb.
Sure.
Basically, like, being seen as a bad guy in this story doesn't mean that the author viewed you as a bad guy. Like, with reference to the Wicked Witch in particular. It meant that society at the turn of the 20th century viewed you as a bad guy because the book is political allegory.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of this is just going to be lost on anyone who has only seen the movie.
Right, yeah. But it'll still be interesting to kind of know where all of it came from, I feel like. Because we all know what this is about. So we're going to talk about Matilda Joslyn Gage, one of the most prolific suffragettes in American history.
Okay.
We've all heard of Susan B. Anthony, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. She's basically known as the person who fought to give women the right to vote. Well, Matilda Joslyn Gage, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was right there with her. And in fact, Susan and Matilda were such close friends and colleagues for most of their careers that it was literally Susan B. Anthony who wrote Matilda's obituary when she died.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now, normally I don't start someone's story with their death. But first of all, it really paints a picture of what a big deal Matilda was to the suffragette movement to tell you Susan the suffragette was the one to eulogize her.
Yeah.
Secondly, though, I think the way Susan describes Matilda's childhood in the obituary is actually the best place to start Matilda's story because it gives a really fantastic insider look into this woman's life, right?
Sure.
So Matilda was born in Cicero, New York on March 24th of 1826. So like kind of keep that time frame in your mind when judging how progressive the Joslyn family was, right? So it's 1826. All right, so here's what Susan B. Anthony had to say. Mrs. Gage was early trained to think and to express her opinions. Being an only child, her parents devoted all their leisure hours to her education. Her father, Dr. Hezekiah Joslyn, was a man of profound thought, well versed in the natural sciences, a skillful physician, and identified with the reforms of the day. Her mother, Helen Leslie, was born in Scotland. She was highly educated, belonged to a noble, influential family, and was married when quite young to Dr. Joslyn. Their home in central New York was always a most pleasant resort for liberal thinkers on religion, politics, and social ethics. To their discussions, the young daughter listened with keen satisfaction and thus early learned the difference between logistical reasoning and mere dogmatism.
That is a pretty fascinating upbringing.
Yeah.
Just knee deep in the philosophical and
Yep.
intellect.
Yeah. Knee deep when you're knee high is crazy. Yeah. So John Quincy Adams is literally president at this time. Like that's how long ago it was.
Wow.
But her parents were like, listen, baby Matilda Electa, because they were so political, they made her middle name Electa. Just because the people in charge say something is true and other people accept it does not mean that you have to accept it. If somebody tells you something is incontrovertible, you sit there and you think about it before you decide whether or not to believe them. Like they were very, very big on that from the time she was like a toddler.
Sure.
So what Dr. and Mrs. Joslyn were primarily referring to was slavery because they were staunch, and I mean staunch abolitionists. And 40 years pre-Civil War, that wasn't as common a thing to be passionate about.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like, in fact, slavery wasn't abolished in New York State until the following year. So Matilda was born in a house that was an active stop in the Underground Railroad.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah. She was educated at home for several years before attending a boarding school called Clinton Liberal Institute. I couldn't find details on how long she was there or like what she studied, despite reading through about a dozen contemporary news articles and her official website. But I didn't want to fail to mention that she was highly educated. And their daughter being highly educated was of the utmost importance to the Joslyn family, which is pretty much exactly what you'd expect. Mm-hmm. Matilda married local merchant Henry Gage in 1845 when she was 18 years old, and they bought a house in Fayetteville, New York. That house also became a stop on the Underground Railroad. And this is when Matilda had her first run-in with the law. Even though slavery had been abolished in New York State for nearly 20 years by then, it was still a federal crime under the Fugitive Slave Law Act of 1850. Again, like I couldn't find details about her arrest or like if there was a trial or anything, but I did see several references to her facing prison time for aiding and abetting formerly enslaved people who were making a break for freedom.
Sure.
While emancipation continued to be a cause close to her heart, it was around the same time that she decided, you know what, I'm actually not doing enough to make the world a better place, so I'm going to get involved with the suffragist movement too.
Okay, why not?
Yeah, I mean, if this has been like a running gag I've seen on late night TV, but like, well, they'll go out in the streets and say, "Hey, do you believe in women's suffrage?" And people would be like, "No, oh my God," because they equate suffrage with suffering.
Yes, it's a complicated word.
It is just kind of an odd word, but just to clear it up in case you are not aware, that is women's right to vote.
Yeah.
So that suffragettes were the women who wanted the right to vote. So just to clear that up, just in case you're like a late 90s like Tonight Show girly.
Sometimes it's important to define your terms.
Yes. So just because I'll be using that word a lot. I'm like, you know what? I should just in case put that little asterisk on there.
Yeah.
2 years after coming under fire for her involvement with the Underground Railroad, Matilda attended the Third National Women's Rights Convention in Syracuse in 1852. But just showing up wasn't enough, and she ended up giving a lecture, like unplanned, giving a lecture during the convention on the enfranchisement of women and how slavery and the limited rights of women all stemmed from the same outdated and aberrant patriarchal beliefs. She was the youngest speaker to present that year, and that's when she first met and befriended Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
All right.
She was considered to be, like, by far the most radical of her beliefs of, like, any of the suffragettes of that time.
Okay.
And we'll definitely, like, get more into that a little bit later.
She didn't want women to, like, be driving or anything, did she?
Oh, God forbid. Well, there weren't cars, so
Oh, yeah, that's true.
she probably would have, though.
One day, women will be driving horseless carriages.
A horseless carriage, see?
What is she talking about? This woman's crazy.
Lock her up. What the hell? It's more that female hysteria. So the fact that, like, Susan ended up being the poster child for 19th century feminism is, like, wild to me. Because, like, you would think, like, if she's the one that we're remembering and, like, still talking about and we're trying to put her on the money, she must have been, like, our main one, right?
Yeah.
No. Like, it's crazy because, like, not only was Matilda more passionate about it, she was also very obviously, like, an intersectional feminist who felt just as strongly about black people being people as she did about women being people.
Huh.
And, like, hey, everybody is just as much of a person as wealthy white male landowners. Can we not? But then there's also a part of me that's like, I don't know if this is pessimism necessarily or just, like, realism. But if Matilda was the most radical in her beliefs and the most outspoken, and she was fighting for, like, race-related freedoms too, maybe that's exactly why she's not the one who's still, like, lauded and praised. You know what I mean?
I don't know. Maybe she just didn't have as strong of a PR team. I mean, I don't know. Susan B. Anthony her name is everywhere. Maybe she's just the one that got the hype behind her at the right time, and Matilda just kind of got faded into history like a lot of people do.
I mean, maybe, but you have to, like, they were working together for the majority of their careers.
Yeah.
Like, that's what's crazy. And, like, even Elizabeth Cady Stanton, most people don't know her name. And she was, like, that was Susan B. Anthony's ride or die from beginning to end. So, like, I don't know. But, like, I mean, of course, the men who wrote the history books would want somebody like Matilda silenced and forgotten about. Like, her contemporaries specifically is who I'm talking about. Like, let's kind of forget that this was ever a thing. And especially once women got the right to vote. Spoiler alert, we can vote now. But, like, we were like, you know what? Maybe let's not talk about the fact that that person was also saying these things, because that's too far.
Maybe.
You know?
Maybe. And by the time that civil rights became the norm, her name had kind of already faded a bit.
Well, and I think you're right, because, like, even, like, so have you heard of Ken Burns?
Yeah.
He's, like, an extremely famous documentarian.
Oh, yeah.
He made a documentary in 1999 about the women's suffrage movement, and he only talked about Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. He did not even know to bring her up. Like, what? Ken Burns. So,
that's interesting.
Yeah. But I'm coming down from that soapbox now. We're going to move on with the story.
All right.
Okay. So, for the next several years after that fateful women's rights convention, she continued speaking at conventions and writing articles and pamphlets about the grave injustices being done to women by denying them equal rights with men. Around that time, you guys probably know about this, racial tensions reached their peak, and South Carolina seceded from the United States, thus beginning the Civil War.
Yeah.
Naturally, Matilda's focus pivoted at that point, and she dedicated her time and considerable resources to supporting the Union soldiers. In 1862, she presented a flag to the 122nd New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which was made up of men from central New York. So, like, they're basically the hometown team for her. In the speech she made during the presentation, she was adamant about the fact that this war was not about preserving the Union, but about ending slavery. And her speech included this banger. There can be no permanent peace until the cause of the war is destroyed. And what caused the war? Slavery and nothing else. That is the cornerstone and keystone of the whole. The cries of downtrodden millions are rising to the throne of God. Let each one of you feel the fate of the world be upon your shoulders and fight for yourselves and us and the future. Matilda hosted countless fundraisers at her home to support the boys of the 122nd, who went on to fight in several crucial battles, including those in Antietam, Spotsylvania, and, of course, Gettysburg.
Yeah.
She also helped organize medical supplies and was said to be one of the most enthusiastic workers in Fayetteville. And, of course, her home remained an active stop on the Underground Railroad through the end of the war and the abolition of slavery in America. Fortunately, the Union was victorious in 1864. Huzzah!
We did it.
So here's, now's as good a time as any with the way things are going. Another friendly reminder that if you support the Confederacy, or for that matter, the Nazi Party, or you still believe in the myth of the lost cause, or any of that dumb bullshit, you are a traitor to the United States of America. Freedom and justice for all, and whatnot.
Yeah.
Great. With that settled, at least relatively, Matilda turned her attention back to women's rights. One of the things she's best known for is her flair for the dramatic when staging a protest. Probably the best example of this is from 1886 at the unveiling of the Statue of Liberty. Which, by the way, do you want to do an episode on the Statue of Liberty? Because, I heard a wild story behind the physical inspiration for the statue a couple of weeks ago, and I'm, really tickled about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So the next listener request episode will be you just now requesting that episode. Okay, great.
There you go.
Yeah. Anyway, so it's a beautiful day. There's live music, loads of spectacle. Thousands of people show up for the unveiling of this incredible statue in the New York Harbor. And by people, I mean men.
Yeah.
Of the more than 2,000 people in attendance, only 3 of them were women.
Dang.
You see, unaccompanied women were not allowed to set foot on Liberty Island because it was federal land.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So, it just let that settle in. If you were a woman and you were not there with your father or your husband, you could not step on federal property. Couldn't do it. It's illegal. Obviously, our gal Matilda and her 200 friends that she rolled up with are not going to stand for that. She managed to get her hands on a cattle barge and a megaphone, and she rocked up with all her girls driving laps around the island all through the ceremony.
Wow.
A lot of the women on the barge had signs and banners that said things like, "American women have no liberty," while Matilda was hooting and hollering into that megaphone. As part of her speech, she famously pointed out that the statue was a, quote, gigantic lie, a travesty, a mockery, and the greatest sarcasm of the 19th century. What do you mean that liberty is a lady when women have no rights? Get the fuck out of here with that.
Yeah, if she was a real person, then she'd be arrested for being there.
Yeah, she couldn't even step foot on the island. What are we talking about?
That's a good point.
Ooh wee. So while she made loads of other rousing speeches and protests after that, her main focus was writing, because at that time it was easier to reach more people across the country with the written word than the spoken word.
Sure.
After being a featured writer for a few years, she decided, why not? I'm going to treat myself and buy my own newspaper. She purchased the rights to a suffragist monthly journal in Toledo, Ohio from a woman who was retiring, and thus became the owner and editor-in-chief of the National Citizen and Ballot Box. She had the masthead redesigned to include the words, "The pen is mightier than the sword," because she is a bad bitch.
Yeah.
In her first edition as chief, she wrote, "Its especial object will be to secure national protection to women citizens in the exercise of their rights to vote. It will oppose class legislation of whatever form. Women of every class, condition, rank, and name will find this paper their friend." To give you an idea of why people like Matilda and newspapers like the Ballot Box were so important, there was a law at this time that said that when a man died, he could leave his children to another person in his will, even if their mother was still living.
Oh my God.
That's the extent to which we had no rights. We had no rights to our own children if our husband said so.
Yeah.
Like, if your husband was a piece of shit, he could have his children taken from their mother, and there was nothing that you could do about it.
God.
In response, Matilda wrote that it is sometimes better to be a dead man than a live woman. She ran the paper for the next 3 years before handing it off to another gal and devoting her time to her most important work. It was at this time she partnered with Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Ida Husted Harper to write a book called History of Woman Suffrage. It was published in 6 separate installments between 1881 and 1922. And it does exactly what it says on the tin. It spends about 5,700 pages detailing the entire history of American women's struggle to be awarded equal rights with men.
Wow.
The introduction refers to women's suffrage as the most momentous reform that has been launched on the world, the first organized protest against the injustice which has brooded over the character and destiny of one half of the human race. But of course, even a 5,700-page omnibus isn't going to be enough to keep Matilda busy. Nor was it enough to make her feel like she'd done her part. She was basically the Alexander Hamilton of women's rights, because God forbid I go more than a couple of weeks without bringing up Hamilton. I can't do it.
Well, they both like to write.
They wrote like they're running out of time. Yeah, that's literally, I have that in my script right here. Like, oh my God, but like this broad was out here day and night, like always something new. Like she wrote several pamphlets that were crucial to the movement, including Woman as Inventor, which listed and discussed at length all of the vital inventions created by or with the aid of women. Controversially, she said that the cotton gin was not invented by Eli Whitney, but that he stole the idea from a woman that he knew.
Oh.
Yeah, it's like that was the one that people were like, girl, you've gone too far. I don't know. She also, around this time, wrote the highly inflammatory Women, Church, and State. This specifically is why I think she was written out of the history books, this Women, Church, and State book, because it pretty much blamed the Christian church for the oppression of women throughout history.
That'll probably do it.
I agree with her, but we'll get to that. She also used this particular tract to point out that tying morality and sex is a ridiculous thing to do, especially since women are the ones who are supposedly sinful for expressing their sexuality, and how we're responsible for the whole pesky first sin business.
Yeah.
She argued that placing the burden of morality on women's sexuality in particular was doing a disservice to women and men. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Another thing she tackled head on in Women, Church, and State was the witch trials that were so prevalent across the globe from the 1300s all the way through the 1800s. Tens of thousands of people were executed for witchcraft in that 500-year period, and of course, the vast, vast, vast majority of them were women.
Yeah.
Fewer than 10% of people tried for witchcraft were men. At one point, she describes a mass execution in France where 400 women were burned alive at the same time. Quote, for a crime which never existed save in the imagination of those persecutors, and which grew in their imagination from a false belief in woman's extraordinary wickedness. Yeah. She was one of the first, if not the actual first, to come right out and say that witch hunts were absolutely never about rooting out evil, but rather a church-sanctioned way to murder women who were stepping out of line, who were like simply too educated to submit to the dumbass patriarchy that's been pushed by the church since its inception.
Yeah.
She wrote, the witch was in reality the profoundest thinker, the most advanced scientist of those ages. The persecution which for ages waged against witches was in reality an attack upon science at the hands of the church. And knowledge has ever been power. The church feared its use in women's hands and leveled its deadliest blows at her. Needless to say, Women, Church, and State was banned pretty much everywhere, pretty much right away.
Yeah.
And
right.
All the other suffragist organizations denounced Matilda for writing something so controversial, including Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Well, you when you're doing stuff like this, you're it's you know, you got to be careful about poisoning the well and losing the people and going too extreme. Was it too extreme I guess to many of those it was. But
in the 1800s, certainly.
But was it legitimately? I mean, you make a great point. Maybe this is like the reason that she's kind of pushed aside.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty radical.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And especially for that time. But, like, where's the lie?
Yeah.
You know? But speaking of witches, remember why we're here?
I forgot.
Yeah, remember how we started out talking about Wicked? So let's rewind it a little bit and talk about Matilda's family life. She and her husband Henry had 5 children: Charles, Helen, Thomas, Julia, and Maud.
Mm-hmm.
Maud was the youngest by 10 years. Definitely a surprise baby for the Gages. And she continued surprising her parents throughout her life. One of her biggest surprises was when, in 1882, at the age of 21, she decided to marry a struggling actor. This was particularly shocking for Matilda because Maud was working toward a law degree at Cornell, which was the first Ivy League school to even let women step on to the property. Like,
sure.
So this, a big deal that she even got in, and she's going to give it all up to marry this guy. Needless to say, there weren't, a lot of lady lawyers specifically. Like, she's at an Ivy League studying law. Matilda's like, girl, what do you mean? You gonna go home and be somebody's wife? Great. So, like, Maud passing the bar would have been a huge deal.
Sure.
But, after sitting with the news for a few minutes, Matilda, like, just busted out laughing, like, at herself for the way that she reacted, because she realized that, like, if you want every woman to have the right to choose, that also applies to those women who choose to dedicate their lives to their families instead of having a career.
That's a really good point.
Therefore, Maud had her mother's exuberant blessing when she married L. Frank Baum.
Oh.
Like, we all know who that is, right?
Yeah.
Like, literally every child watches The Wizard of Oz at some point. Like,
yeah.
Every single one of us have engaged with his work. We are very aware of him. So it was after marrying Maud and getting to know her mother Matilda that Frank began work on his most famous work of fiction.
Yeah.
The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, of course. So as I mentioned at the top of the episode, this book is like chock-a-block full of political commentary. And his mother-in-law was an incredibly influential and well-known figure in politics. So of course it's no surprise that she found her way into the series. Based on her writings in Women, Church, and State, it seemed only natural that if he was going to include witches in his story, there was really nobody better to serve as inspiration than Matilda. Obviously, this is where most people would be inclined to make a mother-in-law joke, right?
Probably.
I mean, come on. But despite the fact that the characters based on her are literally witches, Matilda and Frank had a fantastic relationship that was nothing but loving and respectful. Going back to what Matilda herself had explained about the real-life witch trials, the people who society has always referred to as witches are intelligent, outspoken women who aren't going to take no for an answer, who aren't going to accept oppression and indenture, who aren't going to go into the kitchen and make you a sandwich. In the eyes of the public, even in the eyes of other suffragettes, Matilda Gage was radical and evil, and dare I say it, wicked.
Oh.
But Matilda...
Mic drop.
Oh, got him. But Matilda didn't only inspire the Wicked Witch of the West, she was also Frank's muse when writing Glinda the Good Witch of the North. Like, yeah, she was this incredibly outspoken, take-no-shit woman in a time when women were expected to take endless amounts of shit with no response but a smile. But she was also kind and thoughtful and loving as a wife, mother, and friend. Matilda was the one who encouraged Frank to start submitting his short stories and poems for publication. The first person to really believe in him as a writer even after his failures in the theater. Matilda's husband Henry died in 1884, and Frank and Maud moved west 4 years later, settling in what would soon become South Dakota. Matilda decided, what the hell? Women out west need rights too. She began spending every summer with the Baums and convinced legislators in the newly formed state to hold a referendum to give women the right to vote. The idea of giving women equal rights with men was a lot more acceptable in the West because things were like kind of rough out there.
Sure.
Everyone was having to pull their weight. Like, the struggle of the frontier made everyone equal, and it wasn't unheard of for women to become the breadwinners in their own right.
Yeah, you had less options, right?
Exactly. And unfortunately, that still wasn't enough for the men of South Dakota, who voted 2-1 against women's right to vote in 1890. The Baums then moved to Chicago, and Matilda continued to live with them for several months out of the year. She was living there in February of 1895 when she came across a writing contest that she encouraged Frank to enter. While he didn't end up doing that, he did soon start using his free time to really focus on his creative writing. When he asked Matilda for her opinion on the sort of stories he should be writing, she suggested, if you could get up a series of adventures or a Dakota Blizzard adventure where a heroic teacher saves children's lives, or maybe bring in a cyclone. Oh. So that was her idea. Though her health had begun to decline and she was no longer able to travel for speaking engagements or protests, Matilda continued to write like she was running out of time. Her last major speech was written for a convention celebrating the 50th anniversary of the first suffragist conference. The theme of her speech was the femininity of the divine, focusing on her belief that, quote, the feminine will soon be fully restored to its rightful place in creation. Matilda became bedridden during her final visit to the Baums in Chicago, and she died of a stroke in their home on March 18th, 1898. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was published just over 2 years later, allowing her to live on forever through Glinda and the Wicked Witch of the West. Though her cremated remains were interred on the family's private property, a memorial stone was placed in Fayetteville Cemetery to honor her, and the epitaph used was her personal motto, there is a word sweeter than mother, home, or heaven. That word is liberty. And that is the incredible story of Matilda Joslyn Gage, the girl of my dreams, and the inspiration for Wicked.
Yay!
Yay!
Excellent.
Yeah. So, ladies out there, if there's only one thing you take away from Matilda's story, let it be this. Vote. Vote, vote, vote. Anytime there's an election, go vote. Like, voting in presidential elections is important, but real change comes from voting at the state level, the municipal level, like even things that seem minor like school board elections. If you can vote, vote. Because what happens to you directly, what happens in your town to the people close to you, that's decided locally. Mm-hmm. Vote in every election you can. Do not allow yourself to be silenced. Do not ever just lie down and take it. Demand the world you want for yourself and your mothers and your daughters and your friends. Like, if knowing your rights and demanding to be heard makes you a witch, babe, hail Satan with your dying breath. Like, cast hexes, howl at the moon, befriend the local murder of crows. Be as annoying and as loud and as weird as you need to be to get yourself heard. And on that note, thanks for tuning in and giving us a little bit of your time today. Hopefully you enjoyed that story, and if you did, please take a moment to leave us a 5-star rating and a nice little review. You can find us on Instagram and Threads at Fantastic HPod, or on YouTube and TikTok at Fantastic History Podcast. And because we like to mix it up, our email address is even a little bit different. It's fantastichistorypod@gmail.com. Until next time.
Bye.